Well, let's get talking. President Bola Ahmed Tinubu has since assumption of office introduced wide range of policies in fidelity to the pledge that he made to Nigerians at the center of government policies and address business on friendly fiscal and monetary policies, especially multiplicity of tariffs. President has not left anyone in doubt of the direction of the administration's economic policy, which revolves on lifting impediments to a friendly business climate, revenue generation, elimination of multiple taxation, monetary policy reforms, ease of doing business, and growth of the economy would engender shared prosperity amongst the populace. Much seems to have been accomplished within a short time in office in terms of reforms, but let's talk more about this and the implication of all of these moves. And with me for an in-depth analysis this time is to look at the fiscal and monetary policies of the federal government. I have joining me a partner, tax reporting and strategy. He's with PricewaterhouseCoopers, a friend of the house, Mr. Kenneth Erikume. Mr. Erikume, good afternoon. It's good to see you today.
Good afternoon, Tolu. Nice to hear from you today and nice to be in your show. Looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much. Let's get talking. And I think what breaks me mostly now is the issue of foreign exchange market, which we've seen this steady flip-flop considering the opening up of that market. But at the moment, market forces that we want to run this market seems not to be taking us where we want to be. Because as of today, at the other market, is extending for above 900 naira. Do you think this will be addressed shortly with efforts being made at the moment?
Yeah, thanks, Tolu. And I think your introduction alluded to it, that the president's objective around some very specific areas to be able to attract investment, to enable growth and participation of the private sector. For many years, there was this concern around the exchange rate when it was operating at an artificial rate. So one of the things the president did immediately he came into office was, well, not directly because the central bank is an independent arm of government, essentially tried to harmonize the rates, which, of course, was in line with the president's fiscal and monetary policy, which we saw in some of the conversations before the elections. And I think that signal was quite positive because in terms of some of the things that the private sector was looking at, that was a critical component to ensure that people are more confident in making the due investments into the country. Now, what has happened since then is that there has been movement both in the official and what we call the parallel market. Last month, the acting governor of the central bank gave a hint that they were looking at strategies to tackle the slide of the naira, specifically in those two markets. Even though the official market has been relatively stable, I think what people are looking for in that market is very simple: more liquidity so that people can fulfill their obligations. Because we still have outstanding Form A's and Form M's, which need to be fulfilled for people to make payments to their offshore counterparties. The big one, but having said that, that market is relatively stable because that's the official market. It's within the control of the central bank. The parallel market is where the gap and the spread has been increasing. And that's where the issue of concern is. But in the statement of the acting governor, it was very clear that there were going to be some interventions in that space without giving any indication of what those interventions will be. So there's huge anticipation that there will be very specific interventions in terms of the remittance market, as well as in the parallel market, to improve liquidity. Now, like I always say, the quick win in terms of stabilizing the exchange rate is actually to mobilize more of your exchange, foreign currency earnings. And the NNPC, in collaboration with the Ministry of Petroleum Resources, as well as all the regulators in that space, have been making clear interventions to ensure that there is more security, and the issue of crude oil theft is really tackled. The NNPC Group Chief Executive mentioned that we have been able to ramp up production to 1.67 million barrels per day. That's not enough. We need to get it up, even further to maybe 1.8 million barrels per day to ensure that we are driving that consistency of FX earnings. The other bit I think we need to do is to improve the tangible non-oil exports, make it more attractive for the exporters to repatriate their funds through the official market and get it, to actually perform in terms of liquidity. Of course, the big one, which I think the government needs to look at as well, around the intangibles, is that we must export our brains. And this is one of the things that one of my partners, Andrew Nevin, has always proposed, that we need to have a clear outsourcing policy and diaspora policy. So I think that those are some of the areas we can use to improve the official market. Now, what they are going to do will not be successful if you continue to have the parallel market vibrant and having actors that participate from a speculative perspective. So while you can deal with the official market, and I think there is a clear path for that to be tackled, the intervention in the parallel market is where, is what could be challenging. And the acting CBN governor gave a hint that the activities of speculators in that space, they will try as much as possible to tackle it. But if I were to offer my perspectives, I think that there are many transactions that are outside the official market that we classify as ineligible. So if I can give you examples of those transactions that are intangible, but you don't have NOTAP approval, for example, or you do not have a certificate of capital importation, those players would always patronize the parallel market. And the volume of transactions in that space could be significant. But if you are unable to specify the pricing in that market, you will continue to see that spread expand. So what we may see, and me, I'm not speaking on behalf of the central bank, is a bit more control over how the pricing occurs for those ineligible transactions, so that it would ensure that speculation is reduced to the minimum. And of course, the periodic injection of FX into the market, because one of the things forcing people to buy more dollars is the lack of liquidity. If you hoard it and the price keeps going up, then it makes sense to buy and keep. So you need to have a strategy to liquidate those holdings, the FX holdings that people have stacked up, by forcing more liquidity and driving supply. When that happens, systematically, you would see people begin to react by dumping more dollars. So those are some of the things that could, change the fortunes. But, like I said, I believe strongly, these things are not rocket science. I believe strongly that the government is looking at, clear interventions. They didn't want to disclose a lot of the things they want to do. But if you are, someone who looks at this market quite keenly, that some of the steps that they need to take are quite apparent. Let me give you an example. The CBN has directed, for remittances to be made within the limit of negative 2.5% or positive 2.5% of the previous day's average rate. That way they can then control the exchange rate at which remittances coming from the diaspora is being exchanged. But if that then filters out of the official market into the P2P, the peer-to-peer market where people are exchanging directly, then it can continue to exchange at 900 or thereabouts. So those are clear indications that government wants to intervene, and they will intervene. So let's watch this space and hope that the decisions made by government would continue to drive stability for the FX market.
Wow. That's a good way to start this discussion, in depth breakdown. Mr. Kenneth, I'd like you to sit up a bit so that we get proper headroom and we can have a proper picture of you. Yes, that is one. But two, let's get to the point where states are now distributing palliatives. I think 2 billion of the 5 billion from the federal government has been released. And according to the state government, it should go to the vulnerable and, of course, the less privileged ones. But my question to you really will be this. If this is properly implemented, what will be the impact, considering our level of poverty in this country?
Yeah, so thank you very much, Tulu. So you are quite right that those palliatives, there is a plan for them to filter down to the states. And I've always been a proponent that the palliatives should not be distributed at the federal level, because the federal government, in terms of the social register, that inventory of those who are the most vulnerable, is, the federal government is far from the people, is far from the grassroots. So the states and the local governments are more well placed to actually intervene and ensure that the social response from the savings coming from the petrol subsidy gets to those who we would consider to be the most vulnerable. So for me, I think that it can be successful. The government has taken the first step to ensure that it's done by the states. That is not to say that the states themselves do not have their own challenges. The critical thing in terms of getting these palliatives to the most vulnerable are factors such as the transparency around the distribution, also the accountability, as well as the adequacy of the capacity of those states to actually reach every sector. So there has to be accountability, transparency, and an infrastructure that actually gets this distribution right the first time. Otherwise, what will happen could be similar to some of the interventions we saw during COVID, where rather than the stock getting to the most vulnerable, some of it got rotten in warehouses. Some of it people had to then break in and cut away because it was being mismanaged. So the issue of mismanagement, corruption, and adequate distribution has to be at the forefront of those interventions. But I strongly believe that those palliatives, if they get to the most vulnerable, would have the most impact. But apart from that, I think that the structure the FAC allocation has taken, with the savings from the subsidy, some of it has been saved for infrastructure, and some of it has been passed on to more FAC allocations to the states. So what that means is that the states have more revenue. And what the state governments have been tasked with is two things. First of all, bring the salary payments up to date. So deal with the backlog of salary payments. And that has a cascading effect across the citizens of the states, because once you get the public sector salaries going, there are many individuals, family members, workers that are dependent on those people, that it will then trickle down, even the market people as well, to then trickle down because their purchasing power will go up. Of course, the second thing that they were tasked with which also makes sense, is to deal with the issue of backlog of things like pensions. And if the states can then deal with that, of course, you're already getting the benefit of that subsidy savings into a distribution network in terms of salaries that you can guarantee and is very secure. But outside of that, getting that distribution from the various states. I know a lot of the states in the north have begun to try to get that distribution across to the most vulnerable. I believe that it would have a lasting impact and could benefit the society. But the final piece of the jigsaw is infrastructure, specifically transportation infrastructure. If you would ask me for my advice to states, they need to start looking at public-private partnerships to go into investment on transportation infrastructure, whether it be mass transit vehicles or rail transportation, to ensure that that cushions the impact. But the problem with that is that is more long term. It's not immediate. Immediately, people need to eat, people need to earn. So I think those first two initiatives to get the salaries paid as well as get food on the table would be quite important. So I believe it would be successful if some of these measures are taken.
You've talked about states and LGs, of course, getting more money. We've seen what's been happening with FAC in recent times. But we still have a debt we're owing as a country. What do you think about this? You think we might be pushed to want to borrow if we're pushed to the wall? And let's say what your outlook will be. Can we do this in 3 minutes? We are almost out of time.
So, yeah. So I think so. Yeah, it's a lot actually. So I'm just trying to figure out how to attack it.
Go ahead.
I think the first thing debt management is key, right? You need to guarantee your sources of income before you can continue to borrow. So with some of the interventions that have been made by the government, I think that lenders will be more encouraged to give us additional buffers in terms of borrowing. Contrary to what we had before, where questions were being asked around the exchange rate and the harmonization of the exchange rates, the removal of fuel subsidy, and so on and so forth. So there would be more appetite for borrowing. However, I do not believe that borrowing more is the most important strategy at this time. We need to get the cash flow up and running. Already, our debt service to revenue ratio is quite high, and breaking all the benchmarks that we would have liked. So government needs to look at how to ensure that the revenue generation is expanded. And one of the things which I say is that you shouldn't go and begin to tax or raise taxes or increase the tax burden on the citizens and the corporate citizens. What you can do immediately is to get some value out of your existing assets. So monetizing some of your existing assets. And government has a lot of assets that they could put into production for the benefit of the Nigerian citizens. Just carrying out an audit to identify where all these assets are, where they are sitting, which of the ministries own them, and how they are being applied. And then the next step is, what can we do with these assets? For some of them, you can call in the private sector, international investors to come and do public-private partnerships with you, for example, in the healthcare sector. Some of it you can concession out. For example, in the oil and gas industry, giving out more concessions and earning more signature bonus. And of course, things like, the rail and other infrastructure projects, you can begin to borrow against the future cash flow from those ventures. So those would be the sort of approach, the immediate approach, so that the citizens, like you alluded to, Tolu, do not feel like this vicious cycle is going to continue permanently. We must be able to demonstrate as a people that we are not going to tax the citizens to the ground, but going to be able to generate income from alternative sources. And those sources, those alternative sources, actually stimulate the economy. Because if you do all those things, you then have more economic activity and wealth will increase, and then you can tax that. So for me, that's the sort of approach I would expect from government.
Interesting stuff. I must thank you so much, Mr. Kenneth Erikume, Partner Tax Reporting and Strategy at PricewaterhouseCoopers. Thank you for your time on the show and for your contributions. We sincerely appreciate this.
Thank you, Tolu, and thanks for inviting me. Chat later.